Chapter 1. The Inciting Incident, a Death Among the Mimes. The Hotel Montreux, nestled in the fog-veiled hills above Lake Geneva, was the sort of place that whispered wealth without boasting it. Its corridors gleamed with waxed oak panels, the chandeliers flickered like subdued stars, and the guests spoke in murmurs over their silver-cut breakfasts. But that morning, just past dawn, the tranquillity was shattered, not by a scream, but by a silence too profound. It began in the Salon des Miroirs, the grand ballroom converted for the peculiar festivities of the night before. A troupe of performing artists had hosted a living tableau evening, silent theatre, played out in lifelike poses, recreating scenes from myth and murder with painted faces, white gloves, and ritualistic silence. Among them, the most admired performer was Monsieur André Lefebvre, a celebrated French mime known for portraying death with uncanny realism. So when the housemaid Giselle found him that morning, half reclined on the marble dais, head bent unnaturally to one side, his white face mask smeared and cracked, she assumed it was another artful illusion, until she noticed the blood pooling beneath his collar. The police were summoned promptly and the guests cordoned within the hotel. By 9 a.m., whispers swirled faster than the alpine winds. Someone had murdered Monsieur Lefebvre during the night's performance, or perhaps just after it. The waxen floor still bore the traces of the scene's closing act, glistening footprints across the polished black marble. But oddly, the footprints were not all his. Some were smaller, deliberate, yet stopped halfway across the room and vanished. Colonel Archibald Latham, retired diplomat and host of the performance, had the good sense to call a man whose name still carried hush-toned awe across Europe, Monsieur Hercule Poirot. By a curious stroke of coincidence, or providence, Poirot had already been staying at the Hotel Montreux. A respite, he called it, from the bustle of London life, where too many crimes, mon ami, interrupt the digestion. But Poirot's retirement, as always, was a delicate illusion. When death appeared on his doorstep wearing white gloves and waxen shoes, he sighed gently and smoothed his moustaches with satisfaction. "I fear," he said to the startled concierge, "that my leisure shall again be rudely curtailed. Murder is most inconsiderate." When the crime scene was a study in eerie symmetry, the Salon des Miroirs lived up to its name. Floor-to-ceiling mirrors framed every wall, creating the illusion of infinite space. The stage on which Lefebvre lay was covered in a dark cloth, littered with theatrical props, a toy dagger, a crown of laurels, a papier-mâché skull. Poirot moved silently, observing more than touching. The corpse, already examined by the Swiss police, showed signs of blunt force trauma to the temple. No weapon had yet been found, though the performance had involved many objects that could, in the right hands, become lethal. But Poirot's attention turned quickly to the waxen floor. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, kneeling close, This is artistry of another kind." For the wax, applied to create a luminous, ghostly shine for the theatrical illusion, had recorded something the killer had not anticipated. Footprints, yes, but not all the same. Some bore a dragging heel, consistent with Lefebvre's closing movements. Others were finer, deliberate, and told a different story. Poirot counted 12 steps, then nothing. "Like a spectre that vanished into thin air," he whispered, or like someone who knew precisely where to walk. The ballroom had only 3 doors. One led to the main foyer, one to the costume room, and one, oddly out of place, was a small servants' passage used for bringing in props unnoticed. Poirot glanced up toward the mirrored walls and saw not only his reflection, but the reflections of a dozen doors, all lies. The guests had already begun murmuring in corners about jealousy, rivalries in the troupe, or Lefebvre's rumoured affair with a certain Madame Villiers, a retired opera singer staying in Suite 206. There was also talk of a document, a private letter Lefebvre had been showing off the night before, claiming it would change his life. "It's always a letter," Poirot said mildly, turning to Inspector Fuchs, the balding local officer. "When there is a murder, there is always a letter, or a will, or a secret engagement." Inspector Fuchs was less amused. "We found no letter, no wallet, just his make-up kit and this." He handed Poirot a torn scrap of stiff paper, no bigger than a calling card. On it, in smeared charcoal, were the words, "Tonight, we end the silence." Poirot stared. Curious. By noon, the suspects were being quietly assembled. The waxen footprints still whispered across the floor, but someone had tried to mop the outer edge, clumsily, before being interrupted. Poirot stood over the stage once more. He touched the broken mask at Lefebvre's side and looked toward the mirror directly ahead. "Mirror, mirror," he murmured, "what have you seen?" And in that moment the first seeds of his suspicion bloomed, not of who had murdered Lefebvre, but why someone had chosen this scene, this night, and this method. He straightened his cuffs. The curtain had risen. Chapter 2. The First Clues. Poirot had always believed that a crime scene was like a stage after a play. The props still stood, the curtains swayed gently, but the truth lay not in what was shown, but in what had been concealed. And so, in the quiet aftermath of the living tableau, he moved through the Salon des Miroirs not as a guest, nor as a detective, but as a critic of human folly. Inspector Fuchs, though dutiful, had a heavy hand and a heavier tread. He stood beside Poirot, arms folded, eyes half-closed, while in sceptical deference. "Our pathologist places the time of death between midnight and 2 in the morning, he muttered. "Likely struck from behind. We've sealed off all 3 exits." "And yet," murmured Poirot, "someone did leave. Someone who left behind 12 footsteps and a vanished 13th. He knelt beside the wax-slicked marble once again, taking out a small paper ruler from his pocket. 2 sets of prints indeed, the first scuffed and erratic, likely belonging to the late M. Lefebvre as he performed his closing pantomime. The second, smaller, deliberate, heel to toe, moved with uncanny precision, only to disappear midway. "The floor," Poirot said softly, "is freshly waxed." "Yes. It was part of the atmosphere. Like a dream, no?" Fuchs nodded. "Applied at dusk, dried by curtain time. No one walked the stage before then." Poirot gave a faint smile. "Then these prints must have been made after the wax set, and the vanishing steps, voila, suggest a well-planned illusion, a killer who rehearses." The set was still strewn with the detritus of the previous night's tableau, a velvet curtain backdrop, Grecian columns made of painted wood, and assorted props resting in theatrical disarray. Poirot's eyes scanned everything, but paused at a conspicuously empty pedestal. "Tell me, mon ami," Poirot asked, pointing with his cane, "was something placed there?" Fuchs glanced at his notebook. "A glass goblet, I believe. Part of a Roman banquet scene. Some actresses cradled it before the final pose." "And it is gone?" "We assumed it was taken during clean-up." Poirot made a tutting sound with his tongue. No, that pedestal. It was arranged centre stage, raised and lit. One does not forget to retrieve the centerpiece of the final pose." Fuchs frowned, scribbling a note. Poirot moved toward the costume room next. The door had been ajar when they arrived, and a faint floral fragrance still lingered in the air. A careful sniff, and Poirot's brow arched. Gardenia, he said, more to himself than to the inspector. A perfume both elegant and aggressive. Someone has been here quite recently. The room was cluttered, painted faces, wigs hanging on mannequin heads, drawers overstuffed with gloves and veils. But Poirot's fingers were drawn to a pale silk scarf draped over a cracked leather trunk. It bore the same faint scent and a smudge of something else. He held it to the light. "Grease paint," he said softly. "And powder. Someone changed here, hastily, or attempted to remove something from their costume." Fuchs grunted. "Could be anyone. Most of them returned to the dressing area after the performance." "Mais oui, but this," Poirot replied, lifting a small strand of hair clinging to the scarf, "is not black, like the wigs of the Roman tableau. It is auburn. Someone with red hair was here very late." Fuchs looked doubtful. "Several of the guests fit that description." Poirot smiled thinly. "Yes, and we shall meet each of them soon." Back in the salon, Poirot paused by the ornate side table beside the main exit. His fingers brushed across the edge and then stopped. There, almost hidden beneath a fold of linen, was a smudge of wax and... What? He dabbed a cloth to it gently. "Dusting powder," he murmured, with the faintest hint of shimmer. He turned to Fuchs. Was anyone costumed as a goddess? Cleopatra? Venus? The inspector checked his list. "Madame Celeste Villiers, former opera star. She portrayed Medea." "Ah," Poirot said with interest. "Medea, who murdered her children and fled in a chariot of fire." He did not elaborate further. By early afternoon, Poirot had made a private inventory of missing items. 1. A goblet from the stage centerpiece. 2. A personal letter rumoured to be in Lefebvre's possession. 3rd, and most curiously, a pair of soft-soled shoes worn by one of the performers, spotted in the costume room earlier, but now vanished. Poirot stood once more before the cracked mask that had covered Lefebvre's face. It was not just broken, it had been crushed deliberately. The crack ran not along a seam, but straight through the eye, splitting the pupil in two. Fuchs shrugged. Maybe it broke when he fell. But Poirot's gaze was elsewhere now. His hand hovered over a mirror. Not one of the grand wall mirrors, but a smaller, tilting one used for makeup. And in its corner, smudged but still visible, were the imprints of fingers. 3, not 5. He leaned close. "Someone watched themselves before striking," Poirot whispered, eyes narrowing. "Someone needed to see who they were, or were not, before taking a life." As he straightened, the final clue of the morning caught his eye, resting beside the orchestra pit. A single waxen footprint, facing the opposite direction. Poirot tapped his cane once, as if punctuating a thought. "Yes," he said softly, "the performance is over. But now the real pantomime begins." Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The drawing room of the Hotel Montreux had been hastily transformed into an impromptu interrogation salon. Its windows were drawn, casting the room in a soft grey gloom, with only the ticking of the antique clock breaking the silence. Poirot preferred such spaces, not cold police stations, but refined rooms where tension could simmer beneath etiquette. Human behaviour, he often said, reveals itself more clearly when it believes it must remain polite. Colonel Archibald Latham stood rigid near the fireplace, his pipe unlit in his hand, watching as the remaining guests and performers filed in one by one. A man of precise military bearing, he looked more disturbed by the disruption of order than by the murder itself. Poirot took the centre seat, a high-backed chair with a curved oak frame, as though it were a judge's throne. He gestured with delicacy. "Please, Mes amis, make yourselves comfortable. We are not here to accuse, only to understand. The truth, you see, must be approached gently, like a cat, n'est-ce pas? The group assembled comprised 9 individuals. Each face carried a different arrangement of guilt, annoyance, and unease. 1. Madame Celeste Villiers, retired opera singer, once a celebrated soprano in Milan and Paris. She was tall, imperious, with striking auburn hair swept back in a chignon. She sat apart from the others, gloved hands folded elegantly. "Such ghastly business," she murmured. "André was a man of flair. A pity he had no sense of restraint." Poirot nodded. "And you performed with him last night, we?" "You were Medea." She gave a brittle smile. "He insisted, said it suited my tragic flair, though between us, I loathed the part." 2. Gilbert Sainsbury, the troupe's artistic director. Short, balding, with round spectacles that magnified his watery eyes, he fidgeted constantly with a silver pencil. "André always stole the spotlight," he said bitterly. "He was impossible to direct, treated the troupe like his personal entourage, but murder?" He laughed nervously. No one hated him that much. Poirot did not answer, but observed how Gilbert avoided Celeste's gaze entirely. 3. Vera and Edwin Marbury, a middle-aged British couple, both in matching grey. Vera had a pinched, nervous manner, constantly adjusting her shawl. Edwin, a former solicitor, had a stiff upper lip and the weariness of a man who had once aspired to elegance, but lost the taste for it. "We were guests, nothing more," Edwin insisted. "We watched the performance from the second row." Poirot nodded. "And yet, Madame Marbury, you were seen lingering backstage afterward." Vera flushed. I was looking for my compact. I dropped it near the stage steps." 4. Marius Dubois, a French stagehand with a sallow face and nicotine-stained fingers. He leaned against the wall, arms folded. "André was cruel," he said with a shrug. "Treated us like servants. Said we were invisible. Perhaps now he is invisible, eh?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You sound almost amused, monsieur." "Amusement is cheaper than grief, monsieur." 5. Annika Thorsen, a young Scandinavian dancer, slender as a reed, with pale skin and expressionless blue eyes. She said little, but when she did, it was clipped and cool. "I only joined the troupe 3 months ago," she said. "André barely spoke to me. I danced. That was all." Poirot observed the faint shimmer along her cheekbone, leftover stage makeup perhaps, or something hastily applied to cover tears. 6. Oliver Greaves, an English poet and patron of the arts, lounging dramatically near the window. He had a flowing scarf and the lazy smile of a man who enjoyed tragedy, as long as it wasn't his. "Lefebvre was brilliant," he sighed. "Tortured, of course. All great artists are. He told me something last night, said he was finally free." "Free of what?" Poirot asked. Greaves shrugged. He wouldn't say, just laughed. "I thought he was drunk." 7. Miss Lillian Hatch, the hotel secretary, summoned reluctantly. She was young, with tight curls and a bird-like neck, and seemed almost relieved to be included. "I wasn't at the performance," she said. "But I saw Mr. Lefebvre at the bar around 11. He was arguing with someone. Madame Villiers, I think." Madame Villiers stiffened. "That is an exaggeration. He was drunk and dramatic. He believed I owed him a role in a film project. Nonsense." Poirot sat in silence for a long moment. Then he stood, walking slowly toward the sideboard where tea had been laid out. He poured a cup, but did not drink it. "When an artist dies," he said quietly, "the world always asks, Who ended the brilliance? But I ask, why now? Why last night? What changed? He turned to the group. You see, André Lefebvre had many enemies, yes, but he also had a secret, something he carried with him, something dangerous. There was a pause. No one spoke. Poirot smiled gently. Someone here knows what it was, and someone else is afraid I shall find out. He tapped his cane once on the floor. Thank you, mes amis. You may go, but do not travel far. For before this day ends, we shall all return here. And this time, I shall be the one directing the performance. As they filed out, Poirot turned to Colonel Latham. A fascinating ensemble, he murmured, but one of them lies, and not very well. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. After the suspects had departed and the heavy door to the drawing-room clicked shut behind them, Poirot remained seated, his fingers steepled under his chin, eyes half-lidded in thought. Colonel Latham stood nearby, the unlit pipe now forgotten at his side. "They're a curious lot," the Colonel muttered. "That Sainsbury fellow gives me the shivers, and I don't trust the dancer. Silent people are always the ones hiding something." Poirot blinked, slowly. "Non, mon colonel," he said softly. "It is not the silence that condemns, it is the choice of silence, and when it is broken." Latham frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot rose, adjusted his cuffs, and began a slow, deliberate walk across the room, his patent leather shoes tapping softly on the polished floor. "Observe what we have, yes. A man is found dead in the midst of a theatrical scene. Yet he died not during the applause or even during the performance. He died after, in silence, in the shadows, when no one was watching." Poirot stopped at the window, gazing out over the snowy peaks beyond. Mist was curling down toward the lake now, wrapping the trees in pale arms of fog. "Monsieur Lefebvre," Poirot continued, "was a man of drama, a man who craved the spotlight, and yet his death occurred without witness. It is not the style of the murder that interests me, Colonel. It is the timing." Colonel Latham stepped forward. "You think the murder was staged?" Poirot turned back. "May we? Entirely so, but not for theatricality alone. It was performed for one specific observer." "And who was that?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Me?" The Colonel looked stunned. "You? But the killer couldn't have known you'd be here." Poirot held up a single finger. "Ah, but didn't they? I am not unknown, Colonel. When I travel, it is not a secret. The guest book at Montreux is quite public. I arrived 3 days ago. Monsieur Lefebvre, I am told, arrived only the day after me. Is it so strange to think that someone, perhaps even he himself, knew I was here?" The Colonel's face darkened. "Then, you believe the murder was meant to draw you in?" Poirot tapped his temple gently. "Whether by the victim or the murderer, I do not yet know, but it was no ordinary crime of passion. It was meticulous, calculated, and it used the setting of performance to mask the reality of intention." Later that afternoon, Poirot took a solitary walk through the grounds. The snow was fresh and untouched, except for the bootprints of gardeners and the faint impressions of the morning's bustle. The Swiss air was brisk, crisp with pine and the sharp scent of smoke from chimneys. He passed the terrace where guests often sat in the morning sun. It now stood deserted. A half-melted goblet of wine rested on the stone railing, forgotten. Poirot glanced at it and moved on. Past the greenhouse he came to a narrow pathway lined with waxen hedges, their branches glinting faintly under the sheen of frost. There he stopped. On the ground, in the shadow of the hedge, was a curious sight. Faint indentations in the snow, barely visible. Not footprints in the traditional sense, more like drag marks. Poirot crouched, examining them closely. 2 parallel lines, no heel, no toe. Something slid, not stepped. "Ah," he murmured. "Perhaps a prop. Or a body. No, too small. Something else." He turned to follow the path the mark suggested. They led to a side entrance near the kitchen garden. Poirot tried the handle, locked, but to one side, half hidden beneath a bush, he found a single leather strap, torn at the end. Not a belt, not luggage. Narrow, looped, likely the handle of a costume case or prop bag. Poirot pocketed the strap and rose to his feet. The pieces were gathering but not yet fitting. A performer dead, a stage stripped of one goblet, a letter missing, footsteps that vanished, and now a discarded strap in the snow. He returned to the main building, mind moving in concentric circles of deduction. In the hallway, he passed Miss Hatch, the nervous hotel secretary, who jumped slightly upon seeing him. "Oh, Monsieur Poirot, I didn't see you." "Pas de problème, mademoiselle. You are busy, I am sure." Yes. I've been reviewing the guest logs, as the inspector requested." Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, and did you find anything interesting?" Miss Hatch hesitated. Then, "Well, there was something odd. Yesterday morning, Mr. Lefebvre requested access to the archives room. That's where we store event contracts, performance permits, and old correspondence." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And did he go in?" "Yes. He signed the ledger and took the key, but he never returned it." "And what, pray, did he search for there?" I don't know. He was in for less than 15 minutes. Poirot nodded slowly. "Merci, mademoiselle." He continued down the corridor and paused before the archives door. Locked now, of course. But the scent that lingered was familiar. Gardenia. The same perfume as in the costume room. Madame Villiers again? Or someone else entirely? Back in his suite, Poirot opened his small valise. Inside were 3 items he had collected that day: a torn glove with wax residue, a small strand of auburn hair, and now a broken leather strap. Clues, yes, but still floating, unanchored. He sat by the window and gazed down at the curling fog below, his reflection caught in the glass like a double. "This is not a crime of impulse," he whispered. "It is a composition. Someone has arranged the scene like a painting, but even the most careful brush strokes cannot hide the hand that holds the brush." Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. It was just past 4 in the afternoon when Poirot returned to the Salon des Miroirs, now stripped of performance finery, and echoing only with the faint creak of wood and the muffled clink of teacups from the adjoining parlour. The chairs had been arranged anew, one at the centre for the witness, one for Poirot, and another nearby for Inspector Fuchs, who sat taking notes with reluctant deference. "A private conversation," Poirot had instructed. "Not an interrogation. Let the suspects relax. Only then do they forget their lies." The first to be summoned was Gilbert Sainsbury, the artistic director. He entered with stiff politeness, rubbing his palms together as though perpetually cold. "Sit, monsieur," Poirot said gently. "We are simply speaking, comme les amis." "No need for fear." Gilbert sat, glancing at the mirrors that lined the room's walls. "It's hard not to feel watched in here." Poirot nodded. "Indeed, and yet, is that not the essence of your work? You are accustomed to staging emotions, to controlling how others are seen." Sainsbury gave a brittle smile. "Yes, well, I never expected one of my final acts would involve real blood." "Tell me," Poirot leaned in slightly, "what was the relationship between you and Monsieur Lefebvre?" Gilbert looked away, complicated. He was... Brilliant, but self-absorbed. He changed lines, improvised during live scenes, made everything about him. Yet you continued to work with him. Because audiences paid to see him, not me, not the ensemble, just Lefebvre. A pause. He promised me he'd step down after this tour, said he was moving on. Poirot's brows lifted. Did he say why? Gilbert hesitated. Something about a deal. A film, I think. He said it was going to make him famous beyond theatre, that he didn't need amateurs anymore. Merci, Monsieur Sansbury. Before the man could leave, Poirot added, One more thing. Where were you between midnight and 2? Gilbert swallowed. In my room, alone, reviewing notes. You can ask the night porter. I had a hot water bottle brought up at 12:15. Poirot nodded slowly. Very good. You may go. Next came Madame Celeste Villiers, her perfume arriving a full 10 seconds before she did. She swept into the room like a trained diva, her every gesture rehearsed. She sat without invitation, her chin high. I will speak plainly, Monsieur Poirot, she began. André Lefebvre was a talented man, but impossible. He was obsessed with youth, with staying relevant. Couldn't bear that I was no longer the ingénue. You argued with him last night? She smiled faintly. Yes, he was drunk and arrogant. Said he'd acquired a letter that would destroy illusions. I told him he was mad. A letter? She shrugged. He wouldn't show it, only waved it at me and said the past was finally going to pay him back. I thought he was bluffing. He always was. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And yet, this letter is now missing. Celeste raised an eyebrow. Then perhaps he was bluffing even more than I thought. And after the performance? I went to my room. My maid can confirm it. You did not return to the costume room? Celeste narrowed her eyes. I most certainly did not. Why would I? Poirot didn't answer. She rose before being dismissed, her voice cool. I'm done with morning performances, monsieur. Find the killer, and quickly. Some of us have other engagements. Poirot's next visitor was Miss Annika Thorson. She entered with the quiet grace of a dancer, head bowed slightly, her long fingers intertwined in her lap. You are new to the troupe, mademoiselle, Poirot said kindly. Yes, 3 months. And your impression of Monsieur Lefebvre? She hesitated. He was charismatic, controlling, not cruel, but dismissive. I was invisible to him. You did not speak with him last night? No. Yet you were part of the performance. Annika looked down. He avoided me. I think he thought I was a threat. I'm younger. He didn't like that. Poirot studied her. Did you return to the stage afterward? No, she said quickly. I went to the garden. I needed air. At what time? Shortly after the performance ended, maybe 11. I returned around midnight. Did anyone see you? No, she whispered. Poirot was silent for a moment. You still wear a trace of your performance powder. She blinked. I couldn't scrub it all off. Poirot smiled politely. Of course. Thank you, mademoiselle. Marius Dubois followed, sullen, reeking of tobacco. Poirot wasted little time. You disliked Lefebvre. Everyone did. You have a motive, then? I have no patience for egos, but murder, that's not my style. You were seen near the servants' corridor after the performance. I was collecting props. Which ones? Skull, dagger, goblet. Poirot's voice sharpened. Ah, the goblet, but that was not returned. Marius looked up, confused. I didn't take it. It wasn't there. It was missing from the pedestal. I assumed he kept it. He liked souvenirs. Poirot stared at him for a long beat. Merci, Monsieur Dubois. That will be all. Final interview of the day was Miss Vera Marbury. She entered nervously, eyes darting between Poirot and Fuchs. Her hands trembled. "Monsieur Poirot, I didn't kill him." Poirot smiled warmly. "Then you have nothing to fear, madame." She sat, twisting her ring. "You lingered near the stage, yes?" "I lost my compact. I thought I'd left it under the seats, but I must have dropped it backstage." "Did you find it?" "Number not until this morning. It was in my coat." Poirot leaned forward. "And you saw nothing unusual?" "Number only that Lefebvre seemed tense. He left the stage quickly." "You followed him?" "No." He paused. "Did you ever speak to him?" She hesitated. "He flirted once, months ago. I told him I was married." Poirot watched her carefully, then said softly, "Merci, madame. I believe that is all." When she left, Fuchs spoke for the first time in an hour. "They're all lying, one way or another." Poirot smiled. "Yes, mon ami, but the question is not who lies, it is why. Lies are like stage makeup, applied to enhance or to hide. Either way, the skin beneath is unchanged." He stood. "Tomorrow we will ask different questions. Tonight, let them think. Guilt, like cream, always rises when left to settle." Chapter 6. The First False Lead. By the following morning, the Hotel Montreux had settled into a strained hush. Breakfast was served as usual in the sunroom, but there was little appetite. Silver cutlery clinked quietly, and newspapers were left unread. A guest's glance lingered too long. A waiter's hand trembled. Murder, Poirot reflected, had a curious way of loosening the threads of civility. Poirot himself took a modest breakfast, half a croissant, perfectly cut segments of orange, and a cup of black coffee, on the balcony outside his suite. Below, the lake shimmered in the mist, deceptively calm. It was there that Inspector Fuchs found him, waving a folded piece of paper like a man arriving with triumph clutched in his fist. "We've found it," Fuchs declared, short of breath. "The letter?" Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "Ah, bon?" Fuchs opened the sheet. It was creased, stained faintly with theatrical powder, and bore only a few handwritten lines, angry, precise, underlined twice. "You thought it was buried, but I kept a copy. Speak of me again, and I shall ruin you. See double quote." "Hidden in Lefebvre's shaving kit," Fuchs said. "We'd missed it, folded behind the mirror, likely why the killer took the rest of the letter to conceal the sender's name." Poirot read it again, then folded the note precisely and handed it back. "And you believe this implicates Madame Celeste Villiers?" he asked. Fuchs looked startled. Of course, the initial, the history. She even admitted arguing with him the night of the murder. She had a motive. Poirot stood slowly. "Oui, but only if one takes the obvious route. I prefer to observe the subtle curves in the road." Before Fuchs could reply, Miss Hatch appeared at the edge of the balcony. "There's something else," she said, clearly rattled. "The chambermaid found this under Madame Villiers's bed." She held up a small, curved object wrapped in a napkin. Unwrapped, it revealed a crystal goblet, identical in shape to the one missing from the stage. A faint, brownish stain marked the rim. Poirot stepped forward, peering at the item. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, "our vanished prop." Fuchs smiled thinly. "What more do you need?" She argued with the victim. She had no clear alibi. "Now we find the missing prop, possibly the murder weapon, under her bed." "It is convenient," Poirot said. "Exactly." No, Poirot replied mildly. "Too convenient." Madame Villiers was summoned once more to the salon. She entered with none of her usual flourish. This time her poise was dulled, her voice tighter. "Must we continue this theatre, gentlemen? I've answered your questions." Fuchs dropped the goblet onto the table with a dull clink. Her lips parted, surprised, not alarmed. Poirot said nothing at first. He watched her face with forensic precision. Not the gasp, but the tiny shift in her eyes. Not the denial, but the subtle calculation in her throat as she swallowed. "What is this?" she asked coolly. "Found beneath your bed, madame," Fuchs said. "Do you deny knowledge of it?" "I've never seen it before." "It was the missing prop from the scene," he pressed. "Perhaps used to bludgeon Lefebvre." She stared at it, then laughed bitterly. "You think I beat him to death with a stage goblet, and then hid it beneath my own bed? Am I meant to be that stupid, or that arrogant?" Poirot finally spoke. "Perhaps neither, madame. But consider this. If one wished to frame you, where better to plant the weapon than in a place only you could not have hidden it?" She turned to him, eyes narrowing. "Are you accusing me or defending me?" Poirot gave his most enigmatic smile. "I am only observing, madame." Later, back in the archives room, Poirot stood with Colonel Latham before a series of locked drawers. Miss Hatch, clutching her keys nervously, opened them one by one. "You see," Poirot said, "our Monsieur Lefebvre came here the day before his death, not to admire performance permits, but perhaps to find this letter, the one Inspector Fuchs discovered in the shaving kit. He opened the final drawer himself and retrieved a yellowed file marked Villiers Celeste, 1919 contract dispute." Colonel Latham peered over his shoulder. "That's nearly 20 years old." "Indeed. But here we find a curious footnote." Poirot pointed to the margin, where a line had been added in pencil. "See attached correspondence, letter dated July 14th. Subject, dissolution." But there was no attached letter. Poirot straightened. "Someone removed it, recently." He turned to the Colonel. "Lefebvre threatened someone. A woman, perhaps. But I am no longer convinced it was Madame Villiers." "Then who?" Poirot tapped the edge of the cabinet gently. "The handwriting on the threatening note. It does not match Celeste's signature in this file, but it is oddly similar to a name that appeared only once in the troop's roster. A woman whose role was added late. Someone new, someone overlooked." Latham furrowed his brow. "The dancer?" Poirot nodded. "Mademoiselle Annika Thorsen." But the local constable had already acted on Fuchs's authority. By the time Poirot reached the front steps of the hotel, a uniformed officer had been dispatched to question Madame Villiers further. Poirot watched the snow flurry gently around the departing car. He turned to Fuchs, who appeared smug. "It is always the obvious answer," the inspector said. Poirot merely tilted his head. "Non, mon ami, the obvious answer is never obvious until it is made to appear so." Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. By late afternoon, a hush fell over the hotel like a velvet curtain drawn across a stage. The snow outside had thickened into a heavy flurry, softening the world beyond the tall glass panes. Inside, the warmth seemed curiously at odds with the atmosphere, suffocating as if every guest were holding their breath beneath a shared weight. Poirot, in no rush, sat before the fireplace in the reading lounge, trimming a stray thread from his immaculate cufflink with a tiny silver pair of scissors. Vera Hartley, the pianist, passed by with a book pressed to her chest. She hesitated, sensing something in his silence, and glanced toward him. He smiled softly. "Mademoiselle, may I trouble you for a moment of your time?" She stopped, of course. He gestured to the velvet chair opposite him. She lowered herself into it, her posture still crisp and neat, though there was a hint of weariness behind her eyes now. Something tightened since the day before. "I have been thinking," Poirot said. of artists, and secrets. She tilted her head. There is something curious, he continued. In your performance last night, you played without fault. Impressive, oui, but almost too perfect, as though your fingers sought not music but control. I don't understand. No? Perhaps I am mistaken, but I noticed you barely looked at Monsieur Lefebvre throughout the evening, even during the bows. And when he died, you were not the first to rush forward. In fact, you remained seated for a moment, hands folded. She blinked. That doesn't mean anything. No, perhaps not. Or perhaps it means you were rehearsing, not music, but your reaction. Her eyes narrowed. You think I killed him? Ah, no, mademoiselle, he said gently. But I believe you know something, and it is costing you dearly to hold it in. She glanced toward the hearth, her voice quiet. Do you know what it's like to work with someone like him? He was brilliant, yes, but also cruel, petty, vindictive. He reminded us constantly that we were replaceable, especially Annika. Annika? Poirot leaned forward ever so slightly. She only got her place in the show after Martha, our old dancer, fell ill suddenly. Lefebvre loved the power of casting and uncasting. I heard him threaten to cut Annika just last week if she didn't submit. Poirot was silent for a moment. She told you this? Vera hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but she begged me not to speak. She was terrified. Poirot stood, smoothing his waistcoat. Thank you, mademoiselle. You have helped more than you know. Poirot found Annika Thorsen by the stage, rehearsing alone. She moved with a kind of mechanical elegance, but her footing faltered as soon as she noticed him watching. The music stopped with a scratch of the record player. You're not here to watch me dance, she said, brushing snowflakes from her bare shoulders. So what do you want? Only to talk, Poirot replied. About the past. She didn't reply. Poirot continued. When did you meet Lefebvre? She crossed her arms. Years ago, at a workshop in Prague. He was conducting auditions for a minor company. I didn't get the part. Ah, and yet now you are here. Was it fate, do you think, or something orchestrated? She looked away. I didn't even recognize him at first when I joined this tour. Not until the second week. He changed his name, you know. Poirot nodded. Lefebvre was not his original name, nor is Thorsen yours. That stopped her cold. Shall I say it? He offered, voice soft. Your name was once Clara Bodek. Her eyes widened. Poirot nodded. He cast. You were sighed once, when you were vulnerable and humiliated you, but you reinvented yourself. You became someone else, and now at last you stood on his stage, under his spotlight. Her voice trembled. I never wanted him dead. I believe you, but I also believe he recognized you, perhaps not immediately, but eventually. And he used that knowledge, didn't he? A tear slipped down her cheek. He told me he'd ruin me again, that the world was still full of doors he could close. I begged him not to. Poirot walked closer, retrieving a handkerchief and offering it. Did you see him that night? She hesitated, then nodded. I went to his room just before the performance. I wanted to reason with him. He laughed at me. He said I was still weak, still nothing. I left before I did something I'd regret. Did anyone see you? I made sure of that. Poirot studied her face for a long time. Merci, mademoiselle. I do not believe you killed him. But I believe he gave you cause, and that will matter very much soon. That evening, Poirot sat alone in the salon. Before him lay three things: the threatening note, the recovered goblet, and a small wax seal fragment, retrieved from the crime scene, but not yet discussed aloud. It bore a crest, a lion rampant, circled with a Latin phrase. Miss Hatch entered with tea, pausing to glance at the items. "That's the Latham family crest," she said casually. "You see it on the official archives when sealed by the Colonel himself." Poirot said nothing for a moment, then smiled very gently. "Merci, mademoiselle. That is most helpful." He reached for the goblet, tilted it slightly, and examined the faint smear on the rim again. The residue was not blood, but wax. A melted seal. A performance piece indeed, but perhaps the murder had been staged not with glass but with symbolism, and the time to unmask the illusion was drawing near. Chapter 8. The Seal of Silence. The next morning broke like a sullen bruise across the sky, muted lavender light filtering through snow-blurred windows. At precisely 8:30, Poirot made his way to the Colonel's private study on the second floor, having requested a meeting with the utmost politeness, but a quiet insistence that left little room for denial. Colonel Latham greeted him stiffly. The ex-military man was dressed with habitual precision, pressed wool trousers, a buttoned navy cardigan, and a cravat in the colours of his old regiment. His study smelled faintly of cedar oil and ink, and the heavy bookshelves loomed like sentries. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," the Colonel said, gesturing toward a leather-backed chair. "You'll forgive the lack of tea. My valet is still fumbling with the boiler." "I do not require tea this morning, mon colonel," Poirot said gently. "Only candour." "Candour?" Poirot took his seat. "I found this yesterday. Near the body." He placed the wax seal fragment on the desk, watching the Colonel's face closely. The older man's features tightened slightly, though not with surprise. "Yes," Latham said. "That is mine, or was. One of my personal wax stamps used only on private correspondence." Poirot folded his hands. "I suspected as much. You will understand that finding it so close to Lefebvre's remains presents intriguing implications." The Colonel stood abruptly, walking to the tall window. "He was blackmailing me, Monsieur Poirot." The words hung in the air like frost. Poirot said nothing, only nodded for him to continue. "3 weeks ago," the Colonel began, "I received a letter sealed with my own crest. Inside, photographs, damning ones, from 25 years ago, a scandal during my days in East Africa. It was all buried, forgotten, but Lefebvre had found them. I don't know how." "Did you pay?" Poirot asked softly. "I did, once. I thought it would end there, but he asked for more. Not just money, but favours, influence. Threatened to have the photos released to the press, to my family. I told him I wouldn't be manipulated, that I'd expose him if he continued." "Did you see him the night of the murder?" Latham turned back slowly. "I confronted him in his suite at around 7:30. I handed him a final letter, one that stated in no uncertain terms that I would not bow to extortion. It was sealed with that stamp. He laughed in my face." Poirot considered this. "Where is that letter now?" "I don't know. Perhaps he destroyed it. Perhaps the killer took it." Poirot's gaze lingered on the Colonel's face. The man was rigid, composed, but behind his military discipline was something else, shame and a bitter edge of rage. "Did you kill him, Colonel?" Poirot asked, not unkindly. The silence that followed was long. Then, "No, Monsieur Poirot, I did not." Poirot stood. "Merci. You have told me the truth, or at least a portion of it, and for now that must suffice." Later that morning, Poirot found Miss Hatch seated in the gallery room, paging through an old guest ledger while sipping her usual black tea. "You were right," he said, sitting beside her. "The seal was Latham's, and he has now confessed to being blackmailed." She nodded. "I had my suspicions. He's been tense for weeks. There were whispers among the staff." Poirot leaned in. "May I ask something delicate, mademoiselle?" "Of course." "Was there ever anything between Colonel Latham and Annika Thorson?" Miss Hatch blinked. "Not that I know of. He treats her with politeness, but she's barely spoken to him beyond pleasantries." Poirot frowned. "Then the thread remains tangled." "What are you really chasing, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, lowering her voice. "You keep circling everyone, pulling at their histories, but what are you hoping to find?" He smiled. "A moment of imperfection, a slip, a fracture in the performance." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You know what I think? I think the person who killed Lefebvre was terrified, not enraged, not cold-blooded, just desperate." Poirot's gaze sharpened slightly. "Why do you say that?" "Because whoever it was went through so much effort to make it look like a theatrical scene. But it lacked control. It felt messy beneath the surface, like someone trying to hide chaos under drama." Poirot nodded slowly. "You are astute, Mademoiselle Hatch." He rose and paced to the fireplace, staring into the flames, the seal, the poisoned goblet, the wax residue, the whispered threats, the secret names. Each clue was a player on stage. But what was the script they followed? That night, Poirot returned to the ballroom alone. The stage remained as it had since the murder, cordoned off with velvet rope. The crime scene, preserved like a shrine. He stepped past the rope, studying the floor. Snowflakes from earlier still glistened faintly on the wood. He knelt and traced a subtle indentation in the waxed floorboards with his gloved fingers. A smear, not wax, not blood, grease paint. Poirot rose slowly, eyes alight. He did not yet have the killer, but he had the staging, the moment where illusion and reality fractured. He will call them all together tomorrow. Chapter 9. The cast assembles. The following afternoon arrived with a hush that seemed to descend upon the entire estate. An anticipatory silence thick enough to hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall from nearly every room. Word had spread swiftly. Poirot was calling a gathering. By 3 o'clock the ballroom had been reopened, its velvet ropes drawn back, its cold parquet floor polished to a dark gleam. The lighting was subdued, curtains partly drawn, and outside the forested horizon blurred into soft grey. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle near the stage, where the ill-fated wax sculpture had once stood in its silent glory. Poirot stood before the assembled guests, his small frame composed, his eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. To his left, Inspector Hartley stood near the wall, arms folded, allowing the Belgian detective full control of the stage. Those seated included Colonel Latham, jaw set, and hands clasped tightly over his walking stick. Next to him was Annika Thorson, pale and drawn, her eyes darting intermittently toward the floor. On the other side sat Georgina Morel, her fur-lined coat still clinging to her shoulders despite the warmth of the room, and beside her the ever-silent husband, Malcolm Morel, wearing an expression carved from stone. Kirsten Hatch had taken her place near the end, her lips pressed into a careful line. Lastly, seated slightly apart from the others, was Hugo Quayle, draped in a flamboyant scarf and blinking rapidly, as if sensing something theatrical was about to erupt. Poirot cleared his throat, then began. Mesdames et messieurs, I thank you for joining me. I have now, I believe, gathered the necessary threads of this most troubling affair. And though I have not yet delivered the grand dénouement, he smiled gently, we are close, très close. An audible rustle moved through the guests, but none spoke. Poirot began to pace, his gloved hands behind his back. We have established that Monsieur Lefebvre, an impresario of some repute, had long operated in the shadows, collecting secrets, forging alliances, and yes, indulging in the art of blackmail. Each of you, I suspect, knows how tightly those shadows clung. No one replied. Poirot stopped before Annika. Mademoiselle Thorsen, you were in possession of morphine. You admitted this. Yet it was not your vial I found near the scene, but a smaller bottle, decanted. Someone, perhaps you, perhaps not, used it to prepare a goblet of poisoned wine. Annika's chin lifted slightly. I didn't poison him, she said softly. But I did wish I had. He ruined people I cared about. Poirot bowed his head. Merci. Your honesty, I think, will serve you well. He moved to Colonel Latham. Colonel, you handed Lefebvre a letter sealed with your crest. That seal was found shattered near the body. And yet Lefebvre did not hold the letter. What became of it? I assume he destroyed it, Latham said, his voice crisp. Or perhaps the killer did. Poirot's gaze lingered on him. Indeed. He turned to Georgina Morel. Madame, you visited Lefebvre the night he died, yes? She gave a single nod, her gloved hand tightening over her bag. You claim he was alive when you left. He was, she said. He was gloating. He had something over me. I told him I was done, that he'd get no more favours from my husband's account, and I left. But you saw the wine? Poirot pressed. Did he offer you a drink? Number It was already poured. He drank it after I left, I assume. Poirot studied her, but she offered nothing further. Malcolm remained unmoved beside her. Then Poirot addressed the room. There are many layers to a performance. The mask, the script, the direction. The murder of Lucien Lefebvre was no crime of passion. It was a theatre, grand, symbolic, baroque in its design. But like all productions, it contains a flaw, a place where the illusion breaks. He paused, drawing from his pocket the trace evidence he had recovered. A smear of grease paint, near the stage, not from the waxwork, from a human hand, and in the shadows of that hand lies our truth. He turned then to the one person no one had been watching, Hugo Quayle. Tell me, Monsieur Quayle, where were you between 8:30 and 10 on the night of the murder? Hugo blinked. In my room, sketching. I told the inspector as much. Poirot smiled, but his tone sharpened. And the costume trunk? The grease paint smudge on your cuff? The stage direction in your notes, tucked under your pillow? A soft gasp escaped. From Miss Hatch. Georgina sat up straighter. Annika's eyes widened. Hugo stared. What are you implying? That I killed him? That I staged it all like a play? Poirot nodded solemnly. I am not accusing, not yet. But you see, monsieur, the waxen figure was arranged precisely like your sketched concept for the Red Waltz, your unpublished play, the posture, the lighting, even the poisoned chalice. It is all there, a play never performed, a murder, however, exquisitely choreographed. Hugo's lips parted, then closed. Poirot's eyes flicked to the others. Tomorrow I shall present the final proof. For tonight I ask only this. Stay within the estate grounds. Trust in me, and you will have justice, for Lefebvre and for yourselves. He gave a slight bow, and with that he exited the ballroom, leaving behind a room full of silence, suspicion, and rapidly fraying composure. Chapter 10. The dress rehearsal for death, the next morning, unfolded with a solemn chill. The trees outside the estate stood still as iron pillars, and the usual clink of silverware at breakfast had been replaced by uneasy silence. The guests ate sparsely or not at all. Conversation was halting. Poirot had not appeared downstairs, nor had Hugo Quayle. When Inspector Hartley passed through the dining room, with brisk nods and unreadable eyes, more than one guest watched him with barely concealed dread. Poirot, in truth, was not idle. He had requested the key to Hugo's quarters and, with Inspector Hartley in quiet attendance, spent much of the morning inside the playwright's suite. The fireplace remained cold, though the hearth bore signs of recent use, ashes swept to the edges, embers long extinguished. The scent of wax lingered faintly, curiously out of place. The detective moved methodically through the room. His fingers passed along the edges of books, sketch pads, and a scattering of typewritten pages. Among them lay Hugo's unfinished manuscript of the Red Waltz, its title page faintly smeared with what appeared to be dried stage paint. Poirot examined it with care. Each scene, each cue, each character, there was a macabre poetry to it all. The central act described the execution of a duplicitous impresario by his own cast, a symbolic reckoning arranged like a living sculpture. The victim poisoned by a goblet he had prepared for another. The candlelight, the frozen posture of death, the audience in attendance, unknowing until the curtain fell. It was, undeniably, a mirror of Lefebvre's end. "C'est fascinant," Poirot murmured. Not merely imitation, a confession masked as fiction. Hartley stood by the window, frowning. If he wrote this before the murder, then he plotted it, Poirot finished. And if he wrote it afterward, he is either the killer or wishes to appear so. Hartley folded his arms. Why would anyone want to look guilty of murder? Poirot tapped the manuscript with a gloved finger. For a writer who lived perpetually in the shadows of others' glory, a moment of notoriety, even infamy, may appear preferable to a lifetime of obscurity. They searched further. Inside the wardrobe was a box of theatrical makeup, rouge, grease paint, spirit gum, a false moustache, and a cravat stained with red dye. The adjacent drawer held sketches, one eerily accurate to Lefebvre's final posture. The waxwork was not original. It was a replica of Hugo's own tragic vision. And beneath the drawer, tucked flat between the wood and the lining, Poirot found something stranger still, a photograph. It was old, but not aged. A candid snapshot of a young woman, dark-haired and smiling, standing beside a man unmistakably Hugo, sans scarf or theatrics. The woman's resemblance to Annika Thorsen was uncanny. Poirot's brows rose. "Mon ami, look here." Hartley squinted. "That's Thorsen. I believe it is her sister." The inspector gave a low whistle. "Annika said nothing about family." "No," Poirot said slowly, "because the sister died. A quiet death, a suicide, rumoured to be linked to Lefebvre's manipulation." A long silence passed between them. Hartley shook his head. So Quayle knew. That puts motive back in his court. "Oui, and yet—" Poirot turned toward the bed, lifting the edge of a bedsheet. Tucked beneath the mattress, like a stage prop forgotten between acts, lay an empty wine bottle. The label bore the crest of the Morels' private cellar. "The same vintage Lefebvre drank," Poirot murmured. "And this." He lifted a cork from the floorboards near the nightstand, where it had rolled out of sight. A faint powder clung to the inner edges. "Morphine," Hartley muttered. "You think he poisoned it here?" "Perhaps, or someone wished us to think he did." Poirot straightened, carefully resealing the envelope he had made of Hugo's sketch. "Come, I must speak with Mademoiselle Thorsen. There is a truth still veiled in shadows." As they exited, Poirot took one last glance at the manuscript. It lay open to a passage near the end. The masquerade ends not with applause, but with silence. For even the dead may take their final bow, so long as the stage is set and the lights are dimmed. Poirot smiled grimly. How very theatrical. Downstairs, Annika stood in the conservatory, staring through glass at the frost-covered garden paths. When Poirot entered, she did not turn. "You found it, didn't you?" she said quietly. He approached with care. "The photograph, yes, she was your sister." Annika nodded. "He used her, promised her a life in the arts. Instead, he blackmailed her, humiliated her. She took her life 3 years ago. I never forgave him." Poirot's tone was gentle. "And Hugo Quayle?" Her eyes flickered. "They were friends once. He blamed himself. He changed after her death, wrote feverishly. I isolated myself. But he didn't kill Lefebvre. I swear it." Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Mademoiselle, do you know where Hugo was the night of the murder?" She hesitated. "He said he was with me. But I told the inspector otherwise." "Pourquoi?" "Because I didn't want to drag him down with me," she whispered. "If they found out about the morphine, about what Lefebvre knew, I thought they'd assume Hugo helped me." Poirot gave a slight nod, his suspicions deepening and shifting. "There is still one act left," he said. "The curtain has not yet fallen." And with that, he turned and walked toward the great hall, where the answers waited, in darkness, still hiding behind the final mask. Chapter 11. The Cold Flame in the Cellar. The cellar beneath Morel Hall was older than the estate above it. Its stone arches descended in uneven layers, as if the house had grown from the earth like a myth built upon forgotten relics. Here, lanterns hissed and flickered, and the air hung thick with the scent of damp casks and old secrets. Poirot descended the stairs with deliberate care, each footfall echoing faintly ahead of him. Inspector Hartley followed close behind, his torch slicing through the gloom. They reached the bottom, where the walls were lined with aged wine bottles stacked in neat rows. Many were coated in a thin film of dust, a few conspicuously were not. "This bottle," Poirot said, gesturing toward a vacant shelf near the back, "was removed recently. The one Lefebvre drank from?" Hartley crouched beside the shelf. "We catalogued the vintage. Chateau d'Isard, 1924. Only 3 bottles in the cellar. One's missing, another was found in Hugo's room. That leaves the 3rd untouched." Poirot moved toward the 3rd bottle. It stood straight, perfectly aligned among its neighbors, yet as he pulled it forward and examined its neck, he frowned. No residue, no dust, and look, the cork shows signs of having been pulled and reinserted. Hartley took it, studied it. "Tampered with, or used in substitution," Poirot murmured. "The bottle Lefebvre drank from may not have come from the cellar at all. Someone could have used an empty from this collection and resealed it. But with what inside?" "That," Poirot said, "is the flame we must follow." He walked further into the cellar's depths, where the wall turned abruptly and the space narrowed. A low wooden door, bolted from the outside, stood half-concealed behind a shelf of aged port. Poirot halted. "Have you inspected this?" Hartley raised an eyebrow. "It's a servant's tasting chamber, unused for years." Poirot bent down. The bolt was rusted but recently disturbed. He ran a finger along the lock, revealing a faint smear of grease. He unlatched the door. It creaked open into a small stone chamber. Dust motes stirred in the torchlight. A table stood at its center with a folded cloth over it. On top, a wooden tray held a wine glass, a corkscrew, and a series of tiny vials. Poirot stepped inside slowly as though entering a crypt. On the far wall hung a coat, Lefebvre's unmistakably. Beside it, a crumpled playbill for the Red Waltz with notes scrawled across it in red ink. The handwriting was erratic, unsteady. Hartley read over Poirot's shoulder. "He will drink what he deserves. A final toast to tragedy. This looks like Hugo's hand." Poirot studied the glass vial closest to the centre. Morphine in powdered form, but see, this one. He lifted another vial, empty but faintly stained blue. Hartley's eyes narrowed. Belladonna, fast-acting bitter, hard to trace unless you're looking. Oui, but it is not Quayle who placed this here, Poirot said softly. It is too theatrical for him. Then who? Poirot ran a finger over the surface of the wine glass. Someone clever. Someone who understands mise-en-scène. Who wanted us to see the performance, not the poison? Come, we must return to the hall. The curtain is ready to rise. They emerged from the cellar into the grey hush of the estate's long hallway. The wind outside had begun to rise, scraping against the windows like restless fingers. Poirot paused at the first-floor landing, adjusting his cuffs with his usual precision. Hartley, assemble the guests in the drawing-room. Every one of them. The time has come. The inspector raised a brow. You've solved it? I have understood, Poirot replied quietly, how the final act was staged. But to reveal the culprit, the truth must be played aloud, and our audience must listen carefully. Soon the guests were gathered. The room, once golden with laughter and firelight, now sat muted in dusk and dread. Amelia Morel perched at the edge of a velvet chair, her pale fingers laced tightly. Tobias Gray stood stiffly by the mantel. Dr. Leslie loomed near the liquor cart, not touching a glass. Annika Thorsen sat in the far corner, her eyes never leaving Poirot. Hugo Quayle, summoned last, arrived silent, scarf missing, his expression hollow. Poirot stood in the centre of them all. "My friends," he began, "a man is dead, not by accident, not by madness, but by design. This design, like any work of art, carries with it a structure, a theme, and a hand." No one spoke. Poirot turned, slowly, to the hearth. And this murder, it was not born in hatred alone, it was born of grief, of humiliation, and of theatre. He allowed the silence to settle. There was a script, not merely Hugo Quayle's play, but a script acted out for all of us on that fateful night. The victim, François Lefebvre, drank from a glass that contained not only fine wine, but belladonna, prepared in secret, swapped in silence, and the culprit left behind just enough clues to frame another. He turned to Hugo, whose eyes widened. "No," the playwright whispered. "No, I didn't." Poirot raised a hand gently. "Non, monsieur, you did not, but you were meant to carry the blame." He turned, finally, toward the person seated closest to the fire. "And now, mademoiselle," he said, voice low, "shall we finish your performance?" All heads turned toward Annika Thorsen. Her hands tightened on the armrest. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "In your own words, mademoiselle, how does a tragedy truly end?" Chapter 12. The woman behind the curtain. A stillness had taken hold of the drawing-room, a tension so sharp it hummed in the air like a taut violin string. All eyes had turned toward Annika Thorsen. The flickering fireplace cast long, leaping shadows across her pale face, and yet she did not flinch, not immediately. Poirot stood composed, his hands folded before him, his gaze unrelenting. "Mademoiselle Thorsen," he said gently, "shall we bring the truth into the light?" For a moment, Annika said nothing. Her lips parted as though to speak, then closed. A storm flickered behind her eyes, anger, fear, and something else, something more personal. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said at last, her voice cold and measured. "You do," Poirot replied. "But allow me, if I may, to speak it plainly." He took a slow turn about the room, addressing them all now, drawing each into the weave of his words. "It began, as these things often do, long before we arrived at Morel Hall, in Paris, in a theatre on the left bank. There, a young woman, a costume designer of rare precision and taste, was introduced to an actor on the rise. His name, François Lefebvre. Her name, Annika Thorsen. Gasps stirred from Amelia and Dr. Leslie. Annika said nothing. Poirot went on. Lefebvre was dazzling in his way, yes, but vain. He wore admiration as a mask, not a virtue. To him, Mademoiselle Thorsen was not a partner, but a stepping stone, and when he found an opportunity to ascend, through a wealthy producer's daughter, he discarded her. Poirot turned to Annika. "You lost more than affection, did you not?" "You lost your footing, your position, your reputation." Annika's voice was as brittle as frost. "I survived." "Yes," said Poirot, "but survival came with a price. You vanished from the theatre world entirely. You changed countries. Your name, Thorsen, was once associated with the Grand Théâtre de Lille. I found a single playbill from 1932 with your credit. There were no others. You reinvented yourself." She did not deny it. Poirot moved toward the centre of the room. "When Lefebvre reappeared in your life, older, more bitter, but still proud, it was not as an actor, but as a collaborator in Quayle's new play. Once more he would wear the spotlight, and once more he did not recognize the woman he had cast aside." Annika closed her eyes. The room held its breath. "He mocked you, didn't he?" Poirot asked quietly. "Diminished you again, at rehearsal, at dinner, in private, where no one could hear." Her hand trembled now on the chair's edge. "He said you were beneath him," Poirot continued, "just as before. And this time, mademoiselle, you wrote the ending." The silence broke violently. "I never meant to kill him." Annika stood, her voice sharp, cracking with the weight of what she could no longer contain. "I only wanted him to suffer, just for a moment, to feel powerless." As I did, she was breathing heavily now, all eyes fixed on her. Hugo had stepped back, stunned, as if seeing her for the first time. Emilia looked stricken, confused. Poirot approached gently. "Tell us, then, what happened?" Annika's shoulders sagged. She did not weep, but the firelight revealed glistening eyes. "It was the night of the rehearsal. He'd called me into the cellar, said the lighting cues were wrong again. He made a joke about the costumes, said I could barely stitch together an apron. I told him to stop. He didn't. She stopped, swaying slightly. "I had prepared a vial, just a tincture, belladonna, meant to make him ill. A little revenge, that's all." Hartley stepped closer. "You poured it into the wine?" Number wine laced the inside of the glass he always used. I knew Hugo kept a spare bottle hidden. He always bragged about it. I knew Lefebvre would drink from it once the others went to bed. And then I left. I didn't see him die. I didn't know until the scream woke us. Poirot nodded slowly. "And the wine bottle found in Hugo's room?" She looked at him in surprise. "That wasn't me. I never touched it." Poirot exchanged a glance with Hartley, but said nothing. "Why frame Hugo?" Hartley asked. "He supported you." "I wasn't trying to frame anyone," Annika said bitterly. "I just wanted to be free of Lefebvre. I didn't plan what followed." A deep hush fell once again. Poirot turned to the group. "Murder rarely occurs in isolation. It grows, like a shadow, across a life. And though justice must be served, one must also see the soul behind the act." He looked at Hartley. "You will do what you must, but perhaps the court will weigh the cruelty she suffered." The inspector nodded grimly. Annika said nothing more. She sat again as though drained of all strength. Poirot looked out the window. The wind had died, the storm had passed, but the performance was not quite over, not yet. Chapter 13. the wineglass refrain. The confession of Annika Thorsen had quieted the storm within Morel Hall, but for Hercule Poirot, the silence was not yet peace, it was the deceptive hush of a puzzle still unsolved. Inspector Hartley had taken Annika aside, speaking to her in the low, professional tones of one now duty-bound to follow law where tragedy had already staked its claim. But Poirot remained still, standing by the fireplace, his eyes fixed not on Annika, nor on the guests now lost in their own tremors of thought, but on the gleaming glass decanter still sitting on the drinks tray near the far corner. It was Amelia who broke the stillness. "She admitted it, didn't she?" she said shakily. "She poisoned him." Poirot did not turn to face her. "Oui, Mademoiselle Amelia, but it is a confession. That leaves behind one very strange echo." Amelia frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot stepped closer to the drinks tray. The firelight glinted along the etched surface of the decanter. "Let us revisit the moment, if you will permit me," Poirot said. Annika Thorsen laced the interior of Lefebvre's preferred wine-glass with belladonna, not the wine itself, but the glass. "Yes," said Hartley, now returning. "And yet," Poirot continued, "when Lefebvre's body was found, what did we observe?" Hartley nodded, catching his drift. "There was a spilled glass near his chair, but the wine bottle was found in Hugo's room. A different bottle, and the glass was ordinary, from the kitchen, not from the cabinet." Poirot turned to Hugo. "Monsieur Blackwood, when Lefebvre fetched the wine from your room, was it already open?" Hugo blinked. "Yes, he brought it out already uncorked." Poirot raised a finger. "And that, mon ami, is the final refrain in this song." He turned back to the assembled group. "Let us ask the true question. Why was the poisoned wine-glass never used?" There was a moment of stunned silence. "Because Lefebvre did not drink from it," Poirot answered himself softly. "He did not drink from the wine-glass Annika had prepared." Hartley frowned. "Then how did he ingest the poison?" "He didn't," said Poirot. "Or rather, not the belladonna. It was not the cause of death." Amelia gasped. "But she confessed." "She confessed her intent, yes," said Poirot, "but not the execution." "It was clever, diabolically so. Someone else saw what she had planned, or guessed, and used her attempt to mask their own." Dr. Leslie's voice trembled. "Are you suggesting 2 people tried to kill Lefebvre that night?" Poirot inclined his head. "No, Doctor. I am suggesting that someone saw an opportunity when Annika prepared her trick, and ensured that the true fatal dose was administered elsewhere." He stepped away from the decanter and turned, slowly, toward the grand piano at the room's edge. "There is a recurring theme here, one of deception within performance, masks behind masks. We have focused so tightly on Annika's revenge, we forgot to ask, who else had reason to want François Lefebvre dead?" Silence. The fire cracked softly. Poirot continued. "What if I told you Lefebvre did recognize Annika, that he knew who she was from the beginning, and had no intention of letting her rest in anonymity?" All eyes turned to Annika, who stared back at Poirot in confusion. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Poirot replied, "that someone in this house stood to lose something if the past between you and Lefebvre became known. Someone who had something to hide, not only from Lefebvre, but from all of us." His gaze swept the room. The real poisoner was not interested in theatrical humiliation, but in protection. Protection of a secret long buried, a secret known only to François Lefebvre. He stopped. His gaze rested on a single figure. Dr. Leslie. The elderly man sat very still, the veins in his hand rising stark against the armrest. Poirot's voice softened. "Doctor, you practiced in Paris during the 1930s, did you not?" Leslie's throat moved in a slow, dry swallow. "Yes, briefly." "You treated a young woman," Poirot said, "an actress after a traumatic incident involving François Lefebvre. Not Annika, but another, a young girl, your niece, perhaps." The details were buried. Discreetly. Poirot turned to the others. The doctor did not forget. When Lefebvre resurfaced, he recognized him instantly and feared that in some cruel twist of fate, the truth of what happened years ago would emerge, that justice had never been done, that shame would return. He faced Leslie again. "So you waited. And when Annika took her small revenge, you took a greater one. You added a fatal substance, not belladonna, but strychnine, to the wine Lefebvre fetched from Hugo's room, a bottle none would suspect, since Annika had admitted her own role." Leslie's eyes were hollow now. "She would have killed him anyway." "But she didn't," Poirot said gently. "You did, with precision, with finality." The fire guttered. No one moved. The room had become a stage once more. "I couldn't allow him to ruin another life," Leslie said, voice barely audible. "Not again." Poirot bowed his head. "Then let justice decide whose tragedy this truly was." Chapter 14. Curtains and Consequences. A frigid stillness pressed into the room after Dr. Leslie's whispered confession. The flicker of firelight no longer seemed warm, only solemn, as if reluctant to illuminate the enormity of what had just passed. Inspector Hartley stood unmoving, his notebook forgotten in his hand, while the rest of the party sat suspended in a silence deeper than disbelief. It was the silence of re-evaluation, of rearranging one's memory of every hour in Morell Hall under the weight of a truth no one had anticipated. Dr. Leslie sat perfectly still. His eyes, pale and hollow, gazed toward the velvet curtains as though hoping they might part and offer some reprieve. But none came. Poirot turned slowly toward Hartley, his voice quiet. "You will find the vial, I believe, in Dr. Leslie's medical bag. I imagine it is strychnine sulfate, common in older apothecaries but tightly regulated now. He used just enough to be fatal, timed carefully, knowing how quickly it would act once the wine reached Lefebvre's system." Hartley swallowed, then stepped forward without protest. Dr. Leslie neither moved nor resisted, as the inspector retrieved the small black leather bag from beneath his chair. The soft clink of glass vials inside offered confirmation more chilling than any spoken words. Annika sat stiff-backed, her knuckles white against the arms of her chair. "You knew what he was, what he did, but you never said a word." Leslie gave a slow, tired nod. "I believed he was gone forever, that I would never see his face again. And then he was here, in this house, laughing, performing." Poirot's brow furrowed, not with anger, but with something resembling sympathy. "And when Annika set her trap, you saw it as divine arrangement." "A curtain call," Leslie murmured. "Only I would write the final act." Hugo stood, his face pale. "But my wine! He used my bottle. You drugged it." Poirot turned. "You said to yourself you left the bottle uncorked. Likely Lefebvre did not even check. He poured and drank, perhaps quickly, knowing the performance had left his mouth dry." Emilia rose to her feet slowly. "Then the belladonna in the wine glass, it was never consumed?" "No," Poirot confirmed. "And it might not have killed him even if it had been. Belladonna, while dangerous, is unpredictable in small doses. Dr. Leslie ensured the effect would be immediate, irreversible. He did not risk half measures." Hartley straightened. "Dr. Leslie, I have no choice." Leslie raised a hand, interrupting with a quiet dignity. "I understand, Inspector. I will come peacefully." He stood without fuss, the years seeming to weigh heavier on him now than they had all evening. The other guests remained seated as Hartley led him gently from the room, not in handcuffs, but under a burden heavier than iron. As the echo of their footsteps disappeared down the hallway, the room shifted once again, fragile, raw. Annika stood, her voice trembling. "Then what am I? If I failed to kill him, what does that make me?" Poirot approached her slowly. "You are a woman who was wounded, who sought justice, but justice that skirts vengeance becomes something else entirely. You did not kill Lefebvre, mademoiselle, but you did contribute to a night soaked in fear." She looked away, blinking fast. "Do I turn myself in?" "That is for Inspector Hartley to determine," Poirot said gently. "But morally, I believe your conscience has already judged you more harshly than any court." From the corner, Emilia took a step forward. "And us? Are we all complicit somehow?" Watching him mock everyone. We all laughed. We let him in. Poirot offered a bittersweet smile. "None of us are immune to illusion, Miss Temple. We wanted to be entertained. We saw a magician and forgot to question the trick." The grandfather clock in the hall struck once, an ominous single chime. The evening, so opulent in its beginning, had unravelled into a quiet reckoning. Poirot looked around the room, at the stunned Hugo, the withdrawn Emilia, the mourning Annika. The game had ended, but its cost had yet to be fully counted. "There is no satisfaction in this conclusion," Poirot said softly. "Only understanding. And perhaps that is all a detective may hope to offer." He walked to the centre of the room and gently closed the wine cabinet. "François Lefebvre played many parts," Poirot said, "and in the end he chose one too many." The fire dwindled to embers. The lights above flickered briefly as if to bow, and in the hush that followed, it felt as though Morell Hall itself had finally exhaled. Chapter 15. Shadows on Velvet. The storm had passed. Outside the tall windows of Morell Hall, the dawn was beginning to stretch pale fingers through the thinning mist, brushing the estate's long drive in tentative gold. But within the drawing-room time still held its breath. The air was heavy with unspoken thoughts, trailing behind the truth like shadows on velvet. Emilia Temple sat nearest the hearth now, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She had not spoken since Dr. Leslie's quiet departure. Her posture was neither stiff nor slouched, just hollow. Beside her, Hugo Stillwell stood, arms crossed, looking out the window toward the gravel path where the police car had disappeared. Neither acknowledged the other's presence, though they stood only feet apart. Annika leaned near the grand piano, fingers resting on its closed lid, as though seeking the comfort of something tangible, something solid in the debris of so many illusions. Her profile, once sharply drawn in dramatic arcs of confidence and poise, now appeared weathered and exposed. A woman who had sought closure and found it, just not by her own hand. Poirot remained seated in one of the large armchairs by the fire, his silhouette small beneath the tall backrest, his hands steepled under his chin. He had said little since Hartley left. There was nothing more to solve. The threads had been pulled, the tapestry revealed. Now came the part most people forget, the reckoning in quiet. "You don't look satisfied, monsieur," Annika said softly, breaking the silence. Poirot stirred only slightly. "Satisfaction, mademoiselle, is for the audience. A detective does not seek satisfaction, only clarity." "And did you find it?" Emilia's voice cut across the room, thin as a blade. "Clarity?" Poirot turned his eyes to her. "Oui, but it comes at a cost. Clarity, you see, removes illusion, and illusion is very dear to many hearts." He gestured gently toward the now closed wine cabinet, its gleaming wood polished to perfection. We believed ourselves guests at a performance, safe in our roles as spectators. Yet each of us, in our way, played a part in the tragedy. Hugo finally spoke. "What would you have had us do, Poirot? Throw him out? Accuse him in the middle of his tricks?" "I would have had you listen," Poirot said, "not merely to his words, but to each other. You all knew something was wrong, something didn't fit, yet you chose silence." "Because we were afraid," Amelia said, her voice cracking. "Afraid of looking foolish. Afraid of what we might uncover if we asked the wrong questions." Annika exhaled sharply. "Or the right ones." There was a long pause, and then Hugo walked slowly toward Poirot. "I need to know, Poirot. If Leslie hadn't acted, if Annika's plan had gone ahead, would you have stopped it?" Poirot raised his head. "That depends on whether she had the will to go through with it." "I suspect she did not." Annika stiffened. "You think I'm weak?" "I think you are human," he replied gently. "You sought power in control, in calculation, but when the moment came, when the curtain was rising on the final act, you hesitated, even as you watched him drink from the wrong glass." She looked down, silent. "And what about you, Poirot?" Amelia asked. "You knew before the end, didn't you, about Leslie?" Poirot gave a soft smile. "A suspicion. The broken watch, the meticulous arrangement of the body. These were not Lefebvre's style. They were tidy, professional, silent. He would have made it theatrical. Dr. Leslie, however, was a man of restraint, of quiet conclusions." "So you waited," Hugo said, eyes narrowing. "Why?" "Because often the truth reveals itself more completely when we do not interrupt its course. Had I stopped him earlier, perhaps we would have had a confession without understanding. Now, we know not only who acted, but why." There was a knock at the door. A footman entered hesitantly, bearing a small silver tray. "Telegram for Mr. Poirot, sir." Poirot accepted it with a courteous nod. As the door closed behind the servant, he opened the folded paper, his eyes scanning the contents. A faint flicker of surprise passed across his face, quickly hidden. "Bad news?" Amelia asked. "No," Poirot said, rising to his feet. "Merely a summons. There is always another mystery, another stage, another curtain." Annika tilted her head. "Leaving so soon?" "Ah, mademoiselle, the detective is like the tide. He arrives when the shores are troubled and retreats when the waters grow calm." He took his hat and cane, pausing near the doorway. "I leave you with this. Lefebvre's greatest illusion was not that he could deceive others, but that he believed himself untouchable by the past. It is always waiting, just off stage." Poirot nodded once and turned away, his footsteps fading down the corridor. For a moment no one spoke. Then Amelia said, "He's right, you know." "Yes," Hugo murmured, his voice weary. "But I think we all knew that already." Annika returned to the window, her reflection a ghost against the morning light. In the clearing mists beyond, Morell Hall stood proud and cold, its secrets spent, its velvet shadows lingering only in memory. Chapter 16. The Ashes of Applause. The morning air was still cool when the guests began to depart from Morell Hall. The gravel of the long drive crunched beneath the tires of black cars as one by one figures disappeared beyond the curling mists. There was no fanfare, no polite farewells. Only the hollow hush that lingers after a performance ends, when the lights have dimmed and the velvet curtain hangs motionless, heavy with finality. Inside, silence had settled like dust across the grand spaces. The drawing-room, once alive with murmured suspicion and thinly veiled tension, now felt cavernous, emptied of its purpose. The fire had gone cold, Only a few glasses, half finished, remained as relics of the stormed night. Emilia Temple stood alone at the foot of the staircase, a slender travel bag at her side. She had dressed plainly, all colour stripped from her wardrobe. The black gloves she wore were the only sign of mourning. Not for Lefebvre, but perhaps for something subtler, the unravelling of an illusion she had clung to for too long. She turned at the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Hugo Stillwell emerged from the west corridor, coat folded over his arm, his face drawn, but no longer guarded. He nodded in passing, but paused near the bottom stair. "You're leaving, then," he said, voice low. "There's nothing left to stay for," Emilia replied. Hugo hesitated. "You could have told the truth years ago, about the forgery, the affair, the threats. Why didn't you?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Because no one ever asked." Hugo studied her, as if seeing her for the first time. "You always gave the impression you didn't want to be asked." "That's the trick," she whispered. "I didn't." "And I did." Neither spoke for a moment. Then Emilia lifted her bag. "Take care, Hugo." He didn't stop her as she walked past. He only watched until the front door shut gently behind her, the wind catching the edge of her coat as she stepped into the waiting car. And then she was gone. Upstairs in the guest wing, Annika leaned against the frame of the window in her room, staring out at the misty grounds. The garden below was still wet from the night's rain. A lone gardener moved among the hedges as if nothing had changed. There was a knock, soft but insistent. "Come in," she said without turning. Dr. Melanie Graves stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "You're staying, then?" Annika asked. "For now," Melanie said. "There are still some formalities. The police need statements, timelines." "Of course." Annika's voice was detached. "I imagine Leslie's statement will be the shortest of all." Melanie studied her. "You sound almost disappointed." Annika finally turned from the window. "Disappointed? No, but not really, just unfinished." Melanie nodded. "Closure never feels the way you expect." There was a pause between them. Then Melanie said quietly, "Did you really intend to poison him?" Annika's lips parted slightly. "Yes. And no, I told myself I was ready to do it, that if the opportunity came I'd act. But you didn't." "No," Annika said, "because I saw it in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of being forgotten. Even in death, he wanted to control the ending." Melanie crossed her arms. "He did, in a way." Annika gave a small, bitter laugh. "Only because someone else did it for him." They stood in silence for a few more seconds. Then Melanie said, "You should rest. The press will come eventually. The story's too strange to stay hidden." "I know," Annika replied. "But when they come, I want to be ready." Melanie nodded once and slipped out, leaving Annika alone with the morning. Down in the library, Hugo stood by the fireplace, staring at the old portrait of Lady Morel. Her eyes, rendered in pale oils, seemed to pierce through the centuries. There was something both accusing and amused in her gaze. Poirot had left hours earlier, not a dramatic exit, just a small nod, a final glance, and the gentle echo of polished shoes on marble. Hugo had thought the man would offer closure, but Poirot, like time, did not deal in comfort. Only facts, revelations, and their consequences. He turned as footsteps approached. To his mild surprise, it was Annika. "You're still here," she said. "As are you." They stood across from one another, the fireplace dim between them. "I was thinking," Hugo said slowly, "about what Poirot said. That we were all complicit, that we saw something and said nothing." Annika nodded. "We were all actors in a game we didn't fully understand." But Lefebvre understood it, Hugo added. He knew every role, every weakness. Annika looked down, and yet it wasn't enough to save him. They fell into silence again, but it was no longer strained. Not accusation, not grief, just quiet understanding, the kind that settles between those who have weathered a shared storm and survived it differently. Finally, Annika said, I think I'll leave tonight. There's nothing left in this house but echoes. I'll stay a while longer, Hugo replied. Someone has to close the curtains. The rain began to fall again, soft against the tall windows. The hall was quiet. The stage was empty. The applause, long since faded. But still, the ashes of the show remained. Chapter 17. Curtain Call for the Dead. The rain tapered off by late afternoon, leaving Morell Hall wrapped in a dim blue hush. Low clouds clung to the treetops like a veil refusing to lift. In the drawing-room, a fire had been revived, though it crackled only faintly, more for ceremony than warmth. Most of the house had been cleared. The corridors no longer echoed with tense conversation or wary footsteps. Only two remained now, Hugo Stillwell and Annika Varga. Though separated by years and temperament, a strange camaraderie had bloomed in the wake of the tragedy. They met without planning to, in rooms where memories still hung heavy in the air. Outside, a car approached slowly, wheels hissing over the damp gravel. Hugo glanced up from the library desk, his brow furrowed. He wasn't expecting visitors. Police again? Annika asked, entering quietly behind him. Number! The police were satisfied with Poirot's summary, Hugo said, stepping toward the window. They've made no arrests, no final declaration, just questions, quietly filed away. Annika joined him at the window just as the car came to a stop beneath the portico. A man stepped out. He wore no uniform, just a raincoat and a bowler hat. He paused for a moment under the grey sky, then proceeded toward the entrance with a walking stick and a leather satchel. Not a policeman, Annika murmured. Not a reporter, either. Too calm. Moments later, he was announced by the housekeeper, who had remained behind to oversee the final closure of the estate. Mr. Alderney wishes to speak with you both, she said hesitantly. Hugo looked at Annika, then nodded. Show him in. The man entered with quiet confidence. He was in his 60s, white-haired with pale eyes that missed little. He removed his hat and nodded politely. My name is Elias Alderney. I was Lefebvre's solicitor. Hugo tensed. We weren't aware he had one. Mr. Alderney smiled faintly. Lefebvre was discreet. He often preferred people not to know when his affairs were being managed. Why are you here? Annika asked plainly. To deliver something, Alderney replied. A final letter. He instructed that it be handed over only after his death, and only to those who remained behind after the guests had left. He withdrew a sealed envelope from his satchel and placed it on the mantel. Its cream paper was unmarked except for one word written in Lefebvre's unmistakably elegant hand. Curtain. A silence fell. No one else has read it? Hugo asked. No one, Alderney said. I was not even told what it contains. He turned to leave, but paused. I'll be outside for a short while. When you're finished, please let me know if there are any further instructions. The door clicked shut behind him, and once again the house felt sealed in its own quiet spell. Annika approached the envelope. Her fingers hovered over the wax seal. Shall we? She asked. Hugo gave a slow nod. She broke the seal and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, handwritten in blue-black ink. To the ones still standing. Bravo! You stayed after the lights went out. That says something about you, about your endurance, or your guilt. I knew someone would try to kill me that night. And if they didn't, I planned to stage my own death anyway. But someone beat me to the curtain call. I imagine Poirot already told you what matters. He always does. But here's what he didn't know. I left behind more than secrets. There is another letter buried in the pages of The Tempest, first edition, black binding, shelf 3 in the West Wing Library. That one is not for your eyes, it is for the police. I suggest you turn
it in, or don't. It makes no difference now. But if you're reading this, then you survived me. And survival, as I always said, is the finest applause. Anika stared at the page. Her voice was low. He planned everything, even the aftermath. Hugo exhaled. He always wanted the final word. Together they moved toward the West Wing. Neither spoke as they passed shelves of dusty spines and cold marble busts. The Tempest was exactly where the letter claimed. Hugo retrieved it, and inside its cover, folded flat, was another envelope, this one addressed to Chief Inspector Brannick. Anika looked at him. "What will you do?" Hugo's hands tightened on the envelope. What he couldn't. He turned toward the telephone. Behind them, the fire sputtered once, then caught again, its warmth slowly spreading across the long shadows of the house. Chapter 18, the final edition. The inspector's office in London was quiet when the package arrived. A plain envelope, hand-delivered, with the weight of finality in its sealed flap. Chief Inspector Brannick opened it slowly, with the care of a man who had come to expect too many lies sealed in too little truth. Inside, a letter bearing Lefebvre's personal monogram, and a note from Hugo Stillwell confirming it had been recovered from the Morel Hall Library per the late dramatist's instructions. Brannick read in silence. Lefebvre's final letter to the authorities was not a confession, it was an exposé. To the officer who will inevitably inherit my ghost, I trust by now the body has been examined and the clever Belgian has shared his findings. He will have deduced much. But there is something he may not know. My murder was an inevitability. I pushed too hard, uncovered too much, and flaunted it too deliciously. But I did not die in vain. The one who killed me did so out of fear. Not for me, but for what I had discovered about them. You will find within this letter the evidence of a long and orchestrated deception. Anika Varga, celebrated actress, is not who she claims to be. Her real name is Aniko Varga, and in 1921 she vanished from Budapest after a scandal involving the death of a fellow stage director. It was deemed suicide, but I found her letters. I found her stage notes. She was not the victim in that story. She was the architect. Decades later, when I received her letter begging for inclusion in the Daggers rehearsal, I couldn't resist. I invited her, I baited her, and then I died. If you find this, then know she did it again. Unless I was wrong, which would be the greatest tragedy of all. L. Brannick sat back, breath caught between disbelief and dread. His gaze lingered on the letter. Poirot had not accused her. The detective had masterfully pulled the strings, revealing that everyone in the house had motive, means, and a secret to lose. But he had withheld judgment, held the final card close. Perhaps he had wanted Brannick to read it for himself.
Perhaps he knew that truth, unspoken, sometimes struck louder than any accusation. 2 days later, Hercule Poirot stood once more before Morel Hall. The rain had gone, but the mist remained. The house loomed like a stage after the last curtain, a relic of drama long concluded. Inside he found Hugo by the hearth. Anika was not there. "She's gone," Hugo said without being asked. "Left this morning. Said she had a matinee in Vienna." Poirot nodded. "She never liked encores?" "Did she do it?" Hugo asked. "Did she kill him?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped to the mantel, gazing at the place where Lefebvre's final envelope had once rested. "I believe," he said softly, "that Mr. Lefebvre always intended to orchestrate a tragedy. He knew someone wished him dead, perhaps he even welcomed it, as his final act. But he was also a man who delighted in ambiguity." Hugo frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning, mon ami, that even in death he wanted us guessing. Annika may have killed him, she may have merely watched, but the play he staged, the clues he scattered, they did not lead to one truth. They led to many, and he left it to us to decide which curtain call to believe." He turned to Hugo, his eyes somber but steady. "You ask me if she is guilty. I say this: she survived. In Lefebvre's world, that was always the most damning quality of all." Poirot walked to the door. Before leaving, he paused once more. "Do not wait for the final bow, Monsieur Stillwell. Some plays end before the audience realizes the lights have dimmed," and with that he stepped out into the morning mist.